My Savior, I call unto thee.
So, if you'd like to, go ahead and open up a Bible. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9, we're continuing in our lesson in the book of Hebrews. I have a question before we get started. Would you feel comfortable if you had charges laid against you going before a jury and a trial without any representation? I don't know about you, but I don't. Even if it was a civil one. But yet there are some that we've seen, even like mass murderers who have enough of a narcissistic personality that believe that they can represent themselves, and they've taken it on. Even the most ridiculous one was Charles Manson. I mean, he thought he could defend himself, and it was all about him. It was about him. And the judge saw right through it. There was nothing he could do. He kept rejecting lawyers. Ted Bundy is another one that thought that he could represent himself. And all it did was create more problems because, one, they don't know the legal system. There's so many things about it. Now, okay, so let's say we agree that you wouldn't feel very comfortable going before a criminal trial or any type of jury trial without anyone representing you. So who would you want? Would you want a court-appointed one? Not that they're bad, but they're going to do their job. I mean, you're just one case of many cases that they're going to have to get, and they don't really care whether you're guilty or innocent, do they? They're going to look at the case, the odds, the evidence, and either try to persuade you into pleading a deal, or they might say, yeah, let's go to trial. But most of the time, what do they try to do? They try to plead. You know what, Ron? You ought to just kind of take this deal they're offering you because that's the best you're going to get. But I'm innocent. It doesn't matter. What do you mean it doesn't matter? I'm innocent. So we think about that. Now, about the law. When we think about our government, and we have all different types of laws. We have constitutional law, we have civil law, we have criminal law. And each one of those things, does it make you a good citizen? No. I know a lot of people who hate this country. Say it out loud. I hate this country, but they obey all the laws. Now they teeter, some of them will break the laws because what? Who has never gone over the speed limit? Anybody? Anybody? No. Everybody. I'm sorry. Even if you got distracted and you accidentally were going a little fast, or that silly speed limit sign all of a sudden changed on me and I didn't see it, officer. It doesn't matter. What does the law say? The law just says that speed limit in this area from that point on the corner of the curb forward is 45. Had a police officer tell me it's down Valley Drive when he pulled me over. And I said, well, but the speed limit changes and it's right up there. He goes, yeah, but it's right up there. He said, right here, it's 40. But I can see. No. Why? Because that's all the law can do. That's the only thing it can do. And they do it for purposes. I mean, there's a reason why we have speed limits that are reduced when you go through certain zones, like the hospital zone. As a paramedic, we're responding in an ambulance and we're trying to get there, and people are doing 55 through a 25-mile hospital zone is a little aggravating. People aren't watching. They don't realize it. But there's a reason for it, but people don't pay attention to it, especially the one on Loman. I don't know how many people I see continue the same speed or faster and don't realize that they're now in a hospital zone and it's 25. Now you may, well, nobody else does it. Really? So what does the law say? The law goes, oh, okay, Ron, it's okay. Nobody else is following it. No. The law just says guilty. And I love when I would get my tickets over the years, and I'm going to tell you I get tickets, I've gotten them. And go to one of those and listen. If you've never got a ticket before, I encourage you to go down when they have the jury and you go down and you offer innocent, you try to fight your ticket. It's the most comedic moment I've seen. It is. It's funny because people go in there and they don't get it. The law is the law. My friend, a retired state police, used to always laugh because he'd have things on camera. He had an assistant district attorney going 100 miles an hour. He pulled him over. He should have arrested him. And that district attorney said, "Do you know who I am?" And he goes, "I don't care." And he said, "Well, I've got a trial. I've got to get to my house and I've got to get the documents." He'd go slower. What gives you the right? "Well, I'm going to fight this." So he did. So my friend said they got in there in front of the judge, and he turned on the camera and showed the officer, showed the judge, and the judge looked at him and says, "What do you got to say?" And he tried to say something. He goes, "Just stop." Bam, guilty. He wasn't above the law. Law does not make you a good person. Okay, Ron, what has all this to do with Hebrews? A lot. You see, from the beginning, God has spoken things and commanded us and given us instructions. One of the very first one was what? The very first one, remember? There's 2 trees. One don't eat of. That was a law. My dad would say things, that was law. He didn't have to write them down, did he? You knew. So law has always existed. And now that's the universal law. And that's important to understand. Especially when, like we've been going through Romans, and when we come into here in Hebrews, they really overlap. You have to really have clarity about this concepts. And I think as being a citizen, being what I've just explained to you, helps us to understand. One, we all speed, which means we break the law, which means you're a criminal. Whoa, I didn't kill anybody. I didn't rob anybody. But you broke the law, didn't you? What makes you speeding, a better criminal than somebody who murdered? Well, our society would say there's a lot, right? Okay, technically, yeah. But are you a criminal? Yes. Do you deserve judgment? Yes. Most of the time, our judges give us mercy, don't they? And that's what you want. You don't want justice when you stand before the judge and you go, "I plead no contest," which is an amazing thought. That legal loophole there is just amazing because you're pleading guilty, but you're not accepting the guilt. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not a lawyer. But we set these up, don't we? And luckily we get judges, but that's what you want. You don't want justice. Justice would be exactly what the crime said you did. Now, I'm talking about a pure system, not corrupt cops and all these other things. Okay, I'm just talking about the purity. Don't go off on hypotheticals on me. But this applies to being able to understand our relationship with God, to understanding the violations and where we stand. And how can you be right with God? And the law only comes in and says, you're a criminal. Or let's say it biblically, you're a sinner. Same thing. We say criminal. God says sinner. You broke the law. And what should you get? You should get the punishment. Well, you see, luckily we have such a loving God that He goes, that's not what I really want for them. And He pled our case for us before we even sinned. Think of that. Before the foundations of this earth were formed and pulled together, He already pled our case. And He put a plan in motion. And He said it right there in the garden. He said that there would be one that's going to come through you, Eve, that's going to defeat Satan. Now I'm paraphrasing, but that's the point. And the race began. Satan trying to, in the whole Bible, looking at God's plan and His faithfulness and His dependability of following through. No matter what people did, no matter what Satan did, God was faithful and He accomplished it. But there's an intermediate period here, you see, because we got to come back. We got to go to court. You got a court. You can only push it out so far. You can get so many stays so long. And eventually, you have to stand before God. And God has to judge you. He's like that friend of mine who, his reputation, literally, I talked to other police officers, said he would write his mom a ticket. And he said, I did. I pulled her over once. He goes, I wrote it, and he goes, I didn't write her a ticket. But, I mean, that's all that God can do. He can only say, look, I don't care where the speed limit started or where you think you saw the sign, Ron, you're a sinner. And what's the punishment? Well, with God, it's blood. It's blood. That's exactly what the teaching of the Mosaic Law, that was something that was finally written down, that explained that, and start to teach this concept that the only thing that you can do when you go to court, if you didn't have something else, was to sacrifice your blood, your life. I don't care what lawyer you bring. F. Lee Bailey, Johnny Cochran, like God, like that judge shut down that district attorney and said, no, you're guilty. No. Doesn't matter what you try to say, because if you don't come properly before him, it's your blood. It's your life. That's it. So that's a big problem. That's huge, right? So how do we fix this? Well, again, luckily, our Father loves us so much that He put a plan in place. But it took so long, didn't it? Oh, my goodness. I mean, look how long. It took 4,000 years. But what did we learn in that time? Now, to God, it was, a day is 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a day, right? To us, it was 4,000 years. But what evidences we have now that we can look at and we can go, look at what Joshua did. Look at what the people failed. Look at the time period of the judges where they were faithful and not faithful, faithful and not faithful. Look at Rahab, the harlot that God saw in her, the faith that she demonstrated. Look at Ruth, Naomi. Look at Elijah. Look at these men. Look at Joseph, sold in slavery by his brothers, and for over 40 years, never had anything miraculous happen. Look at the faith of Abraham. We can look at those, and two things we learn: how broke we are and how good God is. But we still haven't fixed the problem, haven't we? So God set into motion at the very beginning, because one of the next things we find right after creation is what? What was going on, the next conflict? No, not the murder of the brother. Back up one. Sacrifice. There was a standard, obviously, established, because one brother brought an improper sacrifice and it was rejected. Another brother brought the proper sacrifice. By the way, it was blood. It was animal blood. Get it? That was a shadow within itself, teaching us. But that was law. Now, if you were a Jew in the time when this writer is writing this letter and you're listening to it, he grew up immersed in all of the Mosaic Law. He knew it inside and out. They memorized the Psalms. But there was a gap. There's a gap in what they thought God was going to do and what God had said and proven to them in the Scriptures themselves. And the prophets and the law had said what was going to happen. But they couldn't connect it for some reason. Some of them spiritually blocked. Some of it was possibly a little bit of, God hiding that. But once Jesus came, there was no doubt. He fulfilled everything. All the prophecies of the suffering Messiah, the Lamb of God, the Prince of Peace. He satisfied all of that. He was without blemish. He died for the unrighteous. He was buried among criminals. And he was raised. And he ascended to heaven. All of those things. When Jesus was hanging on that cross, if you'll recall the words that he said, we won't go to the specific words, but every statement he made was like a preacher saying book, chapter, verse to the Jews standing there. We hear him and we marvel. Lord, do not hold us against them. All the things that he said. were pointing them emotionally and logically to a very specific messianic psalm that they knew. And even then they still mocked him, right? But he fulfilled it. And a lot of the Jews, a lot of them became Christians. But they reached a point in time where all of a sudden they suffered some persecution and they started to go back. And what do you go back to? You go back to what you know, what you're comfortable with. And so they're wanting to go back to Mosaic law. That was something they were very comfortable with. And so why I'm building this all up is because there's several concepts that we need to understand. And that's why the title of this lesson is The Earthly and the Heavenly Sanctuary. What's the big deal? Now to the Jew, like I said, a sanctuary and a tabernacle and a temple, they got it. And so he's easily, logically going through and revealing to them things in which they could not refute. You could not debate this guy. The writer of Hebrews, the best of the best, could not debate him because the scriptures he's using to back up exactly what he's saying. One of the greatest ones, and I'll keep bringing this up, is Psalms 110. The idea that he was going to be a king and he was going to be a priest. He brings in the idea that he's the order of Melchizedek, which was not a Hebrew, he wasn't a Jew, he was a Gentile. And Abraham paid him respect. And he gave a tenth of all the spoils of that battle that he had with those kings to this guy. And so he kind of logically pulls it again and he goes, and by the way, if you think about it, the Levites take tithes from the people. That's law. They don't tithe to anybody. The Levites don't tithe. But they did. You know when they tithed? They tithed when Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. Because they weren't yet born, but through their genealogy connection, they actually showed respect to this order of Melchizedek. So he brings up the idea, and you think about David again. David was writing this under what? The Mosaic law. And he brings up this idea that there's a new priesthood. They skipped over that. That's one of them they did not want to connect. Then Jeremiah 31:31, which in the previous chapter we looked at, very clearly says, there is a time coming when I will make a new covenant with my children. And I will gather them all together from all nations, all peoples, Gentiles. He's inferring that. Now, if you're a Jew, you don't hear it that way. What you hear is he's going to bring all the Jews in from all the nations that they got dispersed to in slavery or often prisoners. They're going to bring them back. No. He's talking about, I'm bringing all my children who obey back. And this is a prophet that they can't refute again, but a new covenant, you're going to see where he's saying, by the mentioning of a new covenant by a prophet under Mosaic law, saying new covenant means that the old one's going to go away, the one in which they're under. And when you change law, you change priesthood. You change priesthood, you change law. And legally, you can't argue that. So when was it fulfilled? Jesus. And what does that mean for us? Well, nothing's changed. We still have the same legal problem. We still cannot walk into that throne room and sit there and present ourselves before God without our blood being sacrificed. Something still has to be represented. So all that legalistic things that you read about in Leviticus that just kind of makes you want to skip through and skip the entire book has so much richness for you and I today. There was no abolition of the old law. It was fulfilled in this. And so we've gone through and already discussed, and so we're going to skip on through. But this idea of this lawyer, this mediator, under their system, was a priest, a manly priest. And he keeps kind of reinforcing this. One of the best ways to teach is keep saying the same thing over and over, not like a stutter, but you keep bringing it up, and you keep bringing it up, and you keep bringing it up. And that's what he's been doing. He keeps bringing up this idea of a new priesthood. He keeps bringing up the idea that this new priest is Jesus, and that he can feel everything that we have done because he's lived it. He experienced it. He keeps bringing up the idea of the need for a priest. Not the abolishment of it, but he keeps bringing up the frailness of the old law, the imperfection and how it failed. He keeps bringing up, God even said, it's broke. I got to fix it. I'm bringing in a new covenant. Luke 22:20, Jesus, the night that he established the Lord's Supper, what did he say when he had the cup and he poured it? He said, this is the new covenant in which is in my blood. Life. So now let's jump. Because now he gets back. Now he's talking to Jews, but this is important for us too. So let's read 9:1-5. Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up in its first room were the lampstands and the table with its consecrated bread, which was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called Most Holy Place, which had the golden altar of incense and the golden covered ark of the covenant. The ark contained a gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory, overshadowing the atonement cover. But we cannot discuss these things in detail right now. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry out their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way to the most holy place had yet not been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. This was an illusion for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings and external regulations applying until the time of the new order. See, right there at the end, he says, see what I mean? It's like I said, the law, it's just actions. It's only behavior. It's external. That's all it did. So he brings that up. Now, what's great about the tabernacle? It's the first time that God dwelt among the people. Now, God, in forming that tabernacle, gave a pattern to Moses on the mountain. And he's going to mention that again. So it's going to sound like I'm repeating myself, but he repeats it because of the importance of it. He did not give them plans of a tabernacle of bricks and stone. That was important because when they would move, God was with them. The presence would come down after they set it up, and it would stay there with them. When they would get ready to pack it up, he would vacate it because they couldn't go in there. They would die. They actually had a whole process of folding it up so that they wouldn't expose anything. That's how reverent they had for all the items inside the Holy of Holies. And so that's what is amazing, is it was one, that's not where he really lived. You got it, because you would pack it up and they would watch him ascend, and then they'd watch him descend. But it was establishing the concept. What's the concept? The concept is, who can go in there? Who can go in there and be with God? But it had so many wonderful things that also was attached with it, with these articles that he describes. And he starts to do it, and you notice he catches himself and he goes, well, we really don't have time to go through all of it. But why did he even mention them then? Because they knew exactly what they meant. So do you? When we look at this, this is just an artistic drawing, but some of the things that we see right away, as you look at this, is you see the lampstand. There's 7. It's an oil that they had to minister to. And only the Levites, only the priests could go into here. You could not. And they would light that lampstand and make sure that it kept lit. And every day they would go in and clean the wicks and make sure that it had oil. What does it symbolize? I, for the longest time of my life as a Christian, never really knew. I'm sure my Bible teachers told me that to a Jew meant the presence of God perfectly. 7. And the burning of it, the light, the exposure, was like the light of the presence of the Lord. So they knew it was in there. And the priest going in there knew that he needed to minister to that because that's what it meant. And then we look at the showbread. There were 2 stacks of 6 loaves of bread. Do some simple math. 6 plus 6, 12. How many tribes were there? 12. What's bread? Life. It was a substance in which was life. They would change it out once a week. And the only people that could eat it were the priests. You and I, we couldn't eat it. The next thing that we see that's so important that he talks about is this altar of incense. So what's that for? I'm kind of a personal quiz. Do you remember what it's for? Now, I'll tell you what. I am a candle guy. I love candles. I love to smell. I'll light candles and burn them in my office. Somebody might think I'm having a seance sometimes because what does it do? When you smell that, it evokes something. You enjoy it. That incense burning had to be continuous. And it was very specific in the way they made that incense. You just could not do anything. By the way, the fire, same thing on the altar, had to be very specific. But that was symbolic of our prayers ascending to the Lord in a pleasant aroma. Going up to the Lord like the way that I would inhale that great scent that I love. I love vanilla, so I'm not a crazy guy, but it does something. Lavender is another one that's wonderful, isn't it? But that's what it was. It would go up into heaven, into God, and and that was the prayers of His people. If it wasn't attended to, it was sin. And now we come to the other side of that tent, right? Which I got a little bit better graph here, picture. Now what's amazing is how big do you think it is? Hey, it's God, the creator of the universe. How big's the universe? You got to have something really amazing for that, right? 15 by 15 by 45 feet. That's it. 15 feet wide. I don't even think it's the length of a pew here, width-wise maybe. About the width of the pew here, one row. 45 feet long. It would fit inside this building. And 15 feet tall. 35 feet was the holy side, where they had the lampstand, the incense, and on the Holy of Holies, it was a perfect 15 by 15 by 15. And everything, all the wood was overlaid with gold. But it was puny. Puny. But nobody got to see the other side except that one priest. Once a year, he would come around to this side. Now, he talks about the ark and what it was and the significance of it, and he mentions those items that are inside the ark because they're very important to the Hebrew. To you and I, oh yeah, tablets of stone. I remember that in Bible class. No, these were the ones where the finger of God cut and wrote. Aaron's rod that had bloomed. Anyone remember that one? Oh, the Hebrews did. They all knew. You said Aaron's rod that had bloomed. Not just Aaron's rod. What's important about the blooming of it? You see, there was a conflict where some of the others thought, well, why is Aaron the one that can be so great? Why can't just anybody do it? And so the Lord instructed Moses, have all of them bring their rods and lay them down. And in the morning, the one that blooms, and it's a dead stick, by the way, the one that blooms will be proof that he is the high priest. And it was Aaron's rod that bloomed. So they got it. High priest. You notice how the imagery, he's just logically keeping that Hebrew reader listening to this and the importance of it. And then in a jar was what? Manna that God had provided for the people. And on top of that was the cherubs that were leaning forward with their wings swept forward towards each other. And in the middle of it was the place of mercy. Why? Because that's where the blood was put. And when the blood was placed there, God would give mercy. That's the only place that you could get mercy. That's like going before the judge and you stand there before him. What are you going to bring? Well, Cain learned it, didn't he? It's not fruits and vegetables. It's blood. Now, the problem with that is they had to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. Now, let me back up. They kept offering sacrifices. We'll talk about those. But the only time they went in the back was once a year. On the high priest's clothes, he had bells. If you'll recall the manufacturing of it. Ding-a-ling-a-ling-ling. I used to always wonder, what is that for? That's kind of, who wants to wear something to, well, some people do, I guess, but, that would make a bell ring and all the time. You see, when that one day of atonement came, they were so afraid. Because if the high priest went in there and he didn't do it right, the entire covenant was fractured. And the nation's sins were not forgiven. So they would stand, the Levites would stand on the other side of that and prepare the high priest to go in. And they would tie a rope on his ankle. And they would listen to the bells ring when he went inside there. Okay, he's still moving. Because they knew that if he did it wrong, God would strike him dead. They were afraid. Even the high... Can you imagine if you were the high priest? And okay, it's your turn. Whoa, whoa. And it's like tying safety gear on you, and then you're going to go into a hazardous material environment. It's like... And so they would listen because nobody was going to go in and get you. So they put a rope around your ankle that they could slide you out underneath the curtain. So how precious is that Holy of Holies? Now Moses said, and he was told, build this in the pattern because of what? This is a shadow, basically, of heaven. Can you go into the Holy of Holies? Well, based on what we've learned in the physical drawing of a tabernacle and the way that it functioned, you would say, Matter of fact, you and I, we couldn't even go in on the holy side. We would have to stand outside of it, in the outer court, and bring our sacrifices. And that is something that to us is what he's trying to bring in about the beauty of all of this. Because now it's going to make Jesus and who he is even more precious than ever. Because it was inadequate, to say the nicest you can say about it. And so all of this here, and I've already kind of jumped ahead as I went through it real quick, just a little bit of graphs showing them. But it was frightening. People would see it. And guess where it was at? It was in the center. And the tribes were positioned according to the pattern that God had said. And in the middle was a tabernacle. Everybody knew where it was at. It faced the east, the opening. Everything was very specific. You could come to the outer court if you had committed a sin, and you would bring your sacrifice for those sins. But the big one was the Day of Atonement, which was another teaching point that is the shadow. The shadow means the real thing. When it's complete, you'll look at it and go, I get it. I get it. Because I understand all this stuff with the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies and the blood and the mercy seat and all that. I get it. So they could see that it was Jesus very clearly. I think we've lost that. I think as Christians we've lost the significance of the beauty that we have, what we've accomplished through Jesus. These people that are reading this letter are losing it. And he's reconnecting them to it. But the great thing about this is that while us reading Hebrews, we can go back and see the magnificence of God's glory in what He's provided for you and me today. Because there's still a Holy of Holies. And there's still a priest. Now, Herod, this is what's interesting. They call it the Second Temple, which I've always thought was interesting. You know, God didn't approve at first a building. It was David. David asked, "Can I build you a house? I'm living in this palace as a king, and you're out there in a tent. You deserve better." And finally God said, "You know, okay, but not you, David, because you have too much blood on your hands. But I'll let your son build it." And then the Temple of Solomon, which nobody knows what it looked like, but it had a reputation throughout the modern world there as being something magnificent. When they come back from captivity, we find they rebuilt the temple. But it was a shack compared to Solomon's. And it wasn't really until later on that we see is around 585 BC. So 585 years before Jesus comes, Herod the Great, and he's only great because he was a great builder, okay? So if you ever hear Herod the Great, it's just because he was a great builder. He, through his political connections with Caesar and all them, he builds this temple, and it's called Herod's Temple. And it was amazing. It was 1,800 feet wide. What was the original? 15. It was depth was 1,600 feet deep, 900 feet wide. 9 stories tall. For us that live in Las Cruces, the bank building's 10. Where can you see that building in this city? Almost everywhere. You may not see how big it is, but no matter where you go, if you look up, you could see it, especially when it wasn't as populated as today. 9 stories. And it was just amazing. Just to give you a perspective, I put this little arrow up here to kind of show you. That's a little person there, by the way. Let me show. That's a person. See the size of him right there? These are people. That's a person on the steps going in. Court of the Gentiles. The outer court. The Holy of Holies was on this side. The Holy, and then the Holy of Holies over here. So if you were a Hebrew and you're listening to this, he mentioned tabernacle though. They don't know what they never saw the tabernacle. So it was like you and I in a sense of going, we've never seen a temple. But he took them back to the beginning. He took them back to what was established by God and purposefully. That one, a tent was going to rot. It was going to have to be replaced. It was imperfect. And even this had become such a monument to their faith that it outshined righteousness. As they would ascend, you can imagine this being up on Mount Zion as everybody would approach. The Psalms that we have in our Psalm book, there's a group of them called the Psalm of Ascent. That as the spiritual Jews would travel to Jerusalem, the city, they couldn't help but look at that 9-story tall temple. And that's where God dwelled. Did He? Did He? You talk about putting Him in a box and keeping Him nice and safe right there, putting God in a box. That was the whole thing about the tabernacle. It's temporary. It moved. You had to keep fixing it. You can't build something. But that became the icon of their faith. Now all the sacrifices were the same. That still legally was still being held. So now, with all that said, let's show you the greatness of Jesus. Starting in verse 11. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, He went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, it is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of blood of goats and calves, but He entered the most holy place once for all by His own blood, obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered Himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. For this reason, why? Because He offered His perfect, unblemished self, His blood. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that He has died as a ransom to set free from sins committed under the first covenant. Now, I don't know if you've ever picked up on that very last verse, and I'm going to jump to that one. You see, if you're a Hebrew and you walked away from your religion, you gave up your family rights. You gave up your inheritance. Your family was not going to welcome you to Hanukkah. They weren't going to invite you for the Day of Atonement. They would not talk to you. And then you have to question yourself and go, well, my grandpappy was a Jew. He lived under the old law. Did he die in his sins? So because he wasn't around when this Jesus came, are they all lost? Good question, isn't it? I hear Christians struggle with that logic a lot today. Now, Romans, I'm going to pull a little of my class from this afternoon into this, because Romans, he gives something very beautiful in there in describing the unrighteousness of all men by showing the contrast and comparison. And I've said this again before in these lessons, but it's important to get. He basically says, you Jew had the law, but yet you taught it, you said it was righteous, but you broke it. And then you have these Gentiles who did not have Mosaic law, but yet were obeying what God had commanded by nature, their conscience, their hearts, either accusing them of their behavior, saying it's wrong, or it was right. Where did that come from? Came from God. Came from God. All people are without excuse, Paul says in Romans. But he said there were some that were righteous before God. Even though they weren't circumcised as a Jew, there were some that were still performing the sacrifices and doing things that had been established from the day of Adam and Eve. The patriarchs of the families continued to offer the sacrifices, like we read about Job, who was not a Jew as well. They were out there. We don't have documentation of all of them, but it doesn't mean that everybody outside of the New Testament was condemned to die and be lost. And that last verse right there, tying in with the thought that I just shared with you about Romans looking at the Gentiles, that there were some out there that were still obeying God. And to a Jew, he's going, no, nobody outside of that. When we look at these sacrifices as well, there were three. One was the blood. The lamb or the goat that was brought to them, they would come up outside, if just your sins, they would cut the throat of that goat and watch it die and bleed out. The Levite, the average priest, would take that blood and he would put it around the altar. And then they would take the dead body of that goat and they'd throw it on the fire. And it'd be completely burnt. Then once a year for sin was the atonement we went through in great depth. The other one that was important was what they call burnt offerings, separate and different from the sin or transgression sacrifice. The burnt offering was consecration, your dedication. Somebody that was very zealous and loving God and spiritual would bring a sacrifice that was taken and saying, I dedicate my life to you, God. He's saying, okay, Where are we going? All of this is wrapped up in Christ. They take the fat, remember? And they put that fat on the fire. Where did it ascend to? Up to the Father. The third one was peace offering. And that one was bread. And they would bring that. And that offering was that was a sacrifice of the peace offering. And then they would take a portion and they would eat it and share a meal with each other. When a Jew ate a meal with you, you became family. You became joined together in that offering. All of these have so much richness in this that comes to a fulfillment with Christ. And that's what he's saying. So how much more, like he said, if those blood and ashes were inadequate, but now you have one who has ascended into the throne room. In the earlier chapter we looked at last week, he was sitting at the right hand of God. You notice I never mentioned an article or a piece of furniture that was a chair, because the priests were busy. Why? Sin kept happening. And that was proof in of itself that there was a legal problem. They couldn't do anything that would find... It's like you keep going to court for the same ticket. And you keep going to court, and you keep going back, and you keep going back, and you keep going back, because it can't be satisfied. That's what was going on with this old system. They had to keep doing it, and keep doing it, and keep doing it. But when Christ came, it was satisfied. And instead of him entering in with a bell and a ding-a-ling and a rope, and with the blood of an animal, he entered into that throne room when he ascended to heaven with his blood and brought it to the Father. And the Father said, "Well done. Sit. It is fulfilled. It is satisfied." So why would you go back? Why would you want anything else? So I'm going to ask you, when you think of that, another great symbolic event that occurred to help demonstrate this so profoundly was when Christ died on that cross. What happened? The dead were raised, which is freaky to me. I don't know, where'd they go? I always wonder about that. Anyway, earthquake, sun goes dark for 3 hours in the middle of the day that shouldn't have. But one of the great one that should have just smacked them upside the head. Remember how tall was Herod's temple? 9 stories tall. Nobody could get to the top of that veil and tear it. I know Indiana Jones is pretty limber and he could jump with a knife, and we've seen stuntmen do this stuff. But you were not going to get inside that temple. They had security guards. They had temple guards. So can you imagine the Levites that were inside when Jesus died, and all of a sudden they look up 9 stories and they see that veil tear? That's why I love this picture here. Because what would you do? Oh, no, we can't. That was God saying, the veil is gone. My Son has completed it. What did he say on the cross? It is finished. He wasn't talking biologically. He was not saying, okay, I'm done for, I'm going to die. When he said, it is finished, he said 4,000 human years and planning from the foundations of this earth has brought God's children back because of what I've been able to accomplish. Do you see why later the Hebrew writer is going to say that when the cross was set before him, he saw it as joy? Because he knew that veil was going to be removed. So do you have a mediator before God? There's only one mediator that you can have. And why would you want anyone else? Remember I started out at the beginning asking you about, would you go before a court without a lawyer? Would you take anybody? Hey, you come represent me at the court. No, I think, Darren, you come with me. You're going to be my lawyer. You stand before the judge and represent me. No, I'm sorry. I love you, Darren, but why would you want Muhammad? Why would you want Joseph Smith? Why would you want the Pope? Why would you want anybody on this earth? If there's one thing that you get this morning, is that everything that was physical was corrupt and decaying. And the law and the prophets even admitted it within the existence of that law that the Jews thought was so wonderful and precious. God was telling them, it's broke. There's a day that will come that I will make a new covenant. Jesus said it's in my blood. And then he said, I will gather all my people together and I will write it on their hearts and their minds. And they will no longer teach their neighbor, know the Lord, know the Lord. You know why? Because people who come to God know the Lord. You can't be in this kingdom and not know Him. That's not the way citizenship works in the kingdom. Now, as an American, you can be born and never know until you go to civics class in school that you're a citizen. Right? What? I'm an American? Hey, that's kind of cool. That doesn't happen in this new covenant. That's why it's so amazing. When I read this and got it the first time, my heart sank because I realized, one, salvation and righteousness comes from faith, not through works, but it comes because that veil's been torn and now it's here. And I love it because you know what? I don't know your heart. But the Jews did. They knew everybody's heart because they looked at the outward action and go, hey, you missed your sacrifice this morning. You walked too far on a Sabbath. You know what the law is, Darren. You better shape up. I'm teaching my neighbor. You better comply with the Day of Atonement. And tabernacles, by the way, your little tent was pretty shoddy. You need to do it this way. This is the way the law. And you teach your neighbor, not this new covenant. You see, because you have to make a choice. Do I want to be a part of it? Now, I've given you a lot of stuff to chew on and digest. But I'm telling you, it is magnificent what our Father has done for us. Let Him be your mediator. And it all starts with the conversation that He instructed His disciples before He ascended. You want to be a part of that new covenant? He said, go, make disciples, teach. And he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, and him who does not believe will be condemned. Did I lose anybody on that? I know I'm being sarcastic, and sometimes my sarcasm gets me in a lot of trouble, but I'm a simple person. And I don't know how you can parse that out and get away from the concept that if you want to be in Jesus, you want your sins forgiven, you want to be saved, he says baptism is required. Now, it's not the ceremonial washing. Peter says it's nothing about the water. The water's water. The act of going down and coming up, okay, you dunk and you come up. Okay, there's nothing miraculous about that. But what is your faith being demonstrated to God that you want to be united with His Son in death. But you don't want to stay there. Who can stay underwater long? How long can you stay? What a great symbol. It's a shadow. It's a shadow of resurrection. And He's teaching us that through baptism and showing us, join my Son in that watery grave and rise up like my Son from a grave and live a new life like my Son who is alive with me in heaven. And then come. When your journey's over, come home and enjoy the blessedness of it. Who's your mediator? Have you been talking to him lately? Because he's there continuously. He's not like those priests that get tired. He's there continuously, ready to receive you. But like Jeremiah 31:31 said about that new covenant, you're going to have to open your heart. And then God will write it on your heart and put it into your mind. And then you become a part. And you will respond with faith that acts, like what we saw on the day of Pentecost, where 3,000 people heard what I'm basically kind of saying, and they got it, and they were baptized. So this morning, if we can help you in your relationship, I know there's a long sermon, but man, it's important. I hope that this is a blessing to you, that you will be able to use this to encourage yourself. I hope that if you're not a Christian, that you'll think about the beauty of what Christ has accomplished for you, even while you have rejected Him. He's not holding it against you. He's holding it open for you to come to Him. So think about these things, and if we can help you this morning in your relationship with Him, let us know while we stand and sing.